Welcome to the South Burlington School Board meeting. And I will take comments from the public regarding items that are not on the agenda. Seeing none, we'll move on to any amendments to the agenda, David.
No.
All right, no amendments. We'll move to announcements from our student reps. Cole and Arnell, welcome.
So the SBHS Chamber Choir will be participating in the annual Madrigal Festival, which is organized by SB Choral Director Amy Bushy on Friday, December 7th at 7:30 in the Cathedral of St. Joseph. And then on Wednesday, December the 12th at 7, there will be the SBHS and FHTMS Jazz Concert. And then on Sunday, December 16th at 2, the SBHS Band Concert will happen. And then the next day at 7, Monday, December 17th, the 7th and 8th grade band concert will happen from FHTMS.
And then also from this Monday up to the 21st, LEND, which is an organization, is hosting their annual holiday sorting and organizing event, which is an everyday Monday through Friday thing where any student volunteers can go and help out. And it's a organization that really focuses on giving gifts during the holiday season to any families. And it's a great thing for students to have a chance to volunteer. Also, as Cole and I were saying, of course, the debate and speech team got first place in the Colchester tournament this past weekend. And then a little bit of a look ahead. This Friday is the late start / early dismissal day. And then also for the elementary schools, 2nd through 5th grade winter music programs are about to happen on the 2nd for Central School. And then from the 2nd through 3rd graders, Wednesday, December 12th at 6:30 will be their night. And then the 4th and 5th graders are on Thursday, December 13th at 6:30. And then also, was that a Chamberlain score?
That was Central.
Central. So also the 5th graders are going to be singing on the 10th at the U-Mall, which is a cool event as well. So they're definitely in the holiday spirit. And then also Chamberlain School will hold its winter sing-along on December 12th from 1:15 to 2:15, which was always really fun. So that's awesome.
Speaking personally about
Personally, yes, back at my home. That's it.
Great, other announcements? All right, thank you. We'll move to city and school collaboration.
So our regular scheduled meetings kind of been slowed down. Our next one, Elizabeth, myself, Kevin Dorn, and Helen will be on the 25th of January, which feels like an ancient time away, but probably will be fast upon us. In addition, I'm meeting with some of the city folks tomorrow around some of the scope related to the administrative building and that whole work. So I'll be over there with them tomorrow.
Do we want to do anything with this?
Yes, we
later?
do want to do that. It's coming up in just a second.
Okay, I'll hold on.
Yeah.
All
Remember
right.
last meeting, I tried to move
I know,
things
we're
fast.
I know,
You're
it's hard to
helping, yeah.
ignore that on the table next to me. Sorry, I should have looked ahead.
Yeah, no problem.
We'll move on to agenda item 7, the superintendent's report.
So first item is the state longitudinal data system. I've reported a little bit on that to the board last time. This is again the way in which we send all of our census data into the state, which determines a number of things, but our equalized pupil count, which is a big part of our budgeting process. And we're really we're making progress, but we're still struggling. We've dedicated administrative assistants pretty much from all of our buildings, and so filling in that has been difficult. Both the high school and the middle school are going through all kinds of report card related, data upgrades as well. So it's been really, really challenging. We've also made a transition from Infinite Campus to Power School. At the same time, we're asking to do the collection of the data. So we have dedicated, I think, 3 total straight days to try to make some corrections. So all the folks have been over at the high school working on that. We're going to have 1 or 2 more days. The feedback is we're making good progress. There's a deadline in there, and we've seen some things coming out from the state that they're going to move some things, indicating that we're not alone. I did talk with Dan French, both myself and Mike Martin talked with Dan French last week, and I think helpful awareness, and we're hopeful that the data will get in. Obviously, if we don't, then that equalized pupil number will come to us much later than normal, which I hope is not the case, because it's been delayed in the past, and we really hope it's on time. So that's that. Next in my report is to recognize the Chamberlain School, which we happen to be at. And I just want to quickly read this and let the board, at least, this actually has been in the building since October, but I think it's appropriate and fitting that the board hear a little bit about Chamberlain School. So this came from Dan French, in the end of October. I'm pleased to inform, this is again to the principal, Holly Ruel. I'm pleased to inform you that the Chamberlain School achieved the Vermont PBIS exemplar school status for 17-18 school year. This recognition is the result of a significant commitment on the part of you and your staff to implement positive behavior interventions and supports with fidelity. As secretary, I recognize the importance of a social culture, of a school culture and climate that contributes to the continuous school effectiveness. Your implementation of this multi-tiered system of supports for behavior is an important action toward success for all learners. I thank and congratulate you and your school community for your focus and implementation of this effort. And Dan French, would continue to go on. But again, I wanted to just allow Holly to say a little bit if she wishes. But again, this, as you know, you often hear that acronym PBIS. And again, it's around rewarding positive behaviors as opposed to responding only to negative, right? And so it's a big, big part, and Holly and her staff have been working hard at making that happen. And we have some challenges in our schools, but this has been a really important program. And again, want to give credit where credit is due, and it starts with Holly and her staff in making that happen. But Holly, anything you'd like to update the board on or share with them? They often hear about maybe B-bucks and things like that, but it might be nice to hear a little bit more.
So these are our three expectations right here: be respectful, be responsible, and be safe. And it's all about thinking about those universal strategies that we can do to support the positive with students, and that's the B-bucks that David was talking about, when we have students being respectful, responsible, and safe. We also have a targeted level with interventions for students who might need some extra supports around following our expectations. So we have a check-in and check-out system where students are getting, students who need more adult positive interactions, have a behavior chart point system where they check in with a positive, nurturing adult in the morning and again at the end of the day. And then they also have check-ins throughout the day during the content areas, lunch and recess. And then we also have an intensive component for students who really need extra supports in our school. So it's a three-tiered system of our multi-tiered system of supports. Fits in also with our academic components of universal, targeted, and intensive. And then I was talking to Martin earlier, we're also doing the PBIS coaching. We have Megan Goyette, who's here as our behavior coach, and she is working with teachers intensively to promote the positive evidence-based strategies for classroom teachers that work in a positive way for students. So, for example, we worked at the beginning of the year on our settings. So what are the settings that students are in that promote a positive climate and learning culture? Our expectations, so are we being really specific about all of our expectations, whether it's moving from the rug to your workspace, or entering the music room, or coming into the cafeteria. And just recently we're working on prompts and pre-corrections, so teachers recognized a challenging part of their day that they wanted to get better. And Megan came in and helped them take data. So what are the prompts and pre-corrections, things like using visuals to
Celebrations? I know you do celebrations.
We do,
Huh.
we do all school
We-
celebrations when we fill a high. We had a rainbow day where everyone wore colors of the rainbow, and then grade levels pick their challenges. Fifth grade just picked, a STEM project to work on with spaghetti and marshmallows, building towers, so you could build the tallest tower. So that was actually the fifth grade celebration at our last all-school celebration, so that's happening as well. We also have, once a week assemblies now for the most part, and some of them are grade level led and focused on responsive classroom, components, and some are done by the buzz. So we have Mrs. Farrell, our school nurse, and Tina Brown, our kindergarten teacher, and they are doing like an early morning talk show where they are, interviewing different people, and, they have a fifth grade co-host, so that's a new piece that we started this year as well.
Nice. I don't know if the board has any questions for Holly. Again, this is, our other schools are also PBIS schools, but obviously you might have questions specific to PBIS.
Well, first off, congratulations, well-deserved. I
Yes.
do have a question. Do we ever, as a district, offer any kind of, or sponsor any kind of training for parents and guardians that would provide some of the similar tools for continuity for kids?
We do, so we actually have a parent handbook that we send home each year. It's a
Mhm.
little pamphlet, that goes home to all of our Chamberlain families. We also provide the matrix that we use, which talks about what the expectations look like in the hallway, on the bus, in the classroom, hoping that parents can use some of that same language in their homes, so that there's consistency in the schools. We frequently do little updates in our newsletter to parents. And we're actually having a parent presentation in January in conjunction with the PTO movie night. So the students will be watching the movie with some of our schools out staff, and parents will have, a workshop presentation. I think her name is Sarah Forward, and she is, talking about positive strategies that parents can work on at home with their students that align with the PBIS that's happening here at school.
Awesome. So you gotta come up and be given this. So come on up.
Receive it again.
We get you.
Just give her a hand, yeah.
Yeah. Right. So congratulations.
Back to you. Thank you so much, Holly. Sorry, I don't have your trip.
We're really good at acronyms, but hopefully that helps put some more specifics with that.
All right, we'll move on to administrative reports, agenda item 8.
Yeah, so Mike has joined us for tonight. We're going to give you a little bit of an update, and this links back to 2.2. So as you remember, 2.2, that's monitoring report, 2.2 had the evaluation component to it. It is warned for action. You may not be ready to do that still, but we want to give you a little bit of an update, which was an expectation from our, the previous time the board saw that. So there is I think by your place, a little, a two-pager, a front and back, that talks about where we are. So with that, Mike?
So, when we last discussed this in September, the board asked for an update, partway through the year. And so I'd like to start with some good news. At the time, we were looking at having received 30 of 110 teacher evaluations that needed to be done by the end of last year, that were due or overdue from previous years. And so we had considerable backlog. And we've now through, again, you see the 110 number has come down due to retirements, people on leave. So now we're looking at 54 of 99 for this backlog issue. And so the other things I'd like to update the board on are just the steps that we're taking to try to address this and to try to ensure, obviously, a much better completion rate with our teacher evaluations. We spent a considerable amount of time at our admin team meetings, our district admin team meetings, with all the principals, assistant principals, myself, Joanne Godek, Gary, and our athletic director, talking about evaluations and trying to get to the root of the problem about why we have this perennial backlog that's been an issue across several years. And so kind of the two big themes that really come out are that people want them to be more meaningful, and then also that our evaluations really need to be more about growth and formative feedback for our instructors. So it's important to remember that if there are concerns, that then afterwards there's a performance improvement plan that kicks in. And so the concern was, are we designing a really kind of onerous compliance structure when 95% of the time say it's really about validating great teacher work and figuring out next steps to get even better. And so that may or may not look different than something that's really top-down evaluation, sort of compliance-driven. Looking at the bottom of this first page, too, we're pleased to share that we've started the big group asked for there to be a work group. And so we've been studying and reviewing tools for teacher evaluation. One of them is TeachPoint. I had a 2-hour demo with their salesperson, and then turned and brought sort of a demo back to the work group. We're also looking at tools, really simple walkthrough tools that can pick up data from multiple classroom visits and bring that data back, as well as sending an auto-generated quick feedback to teachers. So you may recall that there's a walkthrough model, which is 5 or more short visits to the classroom with a set criteria, and with an expectation that the evaluator will quickly follow up to give immediate feedback to the teacher, instead of these long processes that can kind of drag out over several months. So that, combined with the formal observation, is an option with our 2-year. We're in the 2nd year of that pilot. So we're trying, it's clear that there's still some clarification that needs to happen there around procedures, and it's clear that principals still need some tools to make that go smoother. So on the back side here, I have some excitement about our work here. On the back side, I have some next steps kind of sketched out, and so these are where we're thinking it's going to go. So right now, I mentioned that this work group that I'm helping to facilitate is really kind of doing a rapid prototyping type work around this walkthrough tool, which is like it's a Google form. We can actually do a lot of this right in Google. So we're working on that so that then we're actually kind of testing it this month, so that as early as January, that's an option. That's a tool for evaluators to use with the teachers that they're going to be evaluating. The other thing, too, that we've already discussed is Superintendent Young freeing up resources to cover principals. As you know, we don't have assistant principals at the elementary schools, and so this would allow coverage for principals who are their own rapid response team on any given day to be able to spend time in classrooms to get the observations written up and the feedback back to teachers. So that's really, hopefully, the big push this spring. Again, scheduling subs, this walkthrough tool, we hope will make evaluations more likely to get done with our evaluators. And then looking down to January, so that's January through June, looking at January 2019, there's also the question of, with this backlog, can we, at any given building, we have several possible evaluators. Can we do some triage for the folks who haven't been evaluated in several years and our new teachers, to give really priority to those groups of teachers? And then also, and I think it was our chair's suggestion, checkpoints, check-ins. And so we'd like to, in March, have the superintendent take stock once we have sort of, each evaluator has their to-do list and a schedule and coverage scheduled with a substitute, to then have a mid-spring check-in where the superintendent can take stock of, okay, how are you doing? What percent do you have done? With the idea that we'll be out of our backlog and everything up to date in June. So that's sort of that's the game plan.
I think it's important to know that when I'm saying administrators, not all. I mean, there are some administrators that have been able to be compliant. You know, again, we're an entire K through 12 team, so we're not you know, calling out individuals. That's my work, but we do have some really strong successes that's happening. That said, we still believe strongly that we're getting feedback that often these evaluations are not as meaningful as they could be, and so what's the format that could change so that we are really helping, you know, continuing to help teachers grow and aspire. So anyway, that's where we are to date.
Question. No, I agree that it should be certainly oriented towards growth of teachers and such, but as far as performance improvement plans, are you able, I wouldn't see that there's any reason why you wouldn't be able to let the board know how many performance improvement plans there have been on an annual basis, and what the results of those PIPs were. I just think that that would give us a fuller picture of what's happening with the evaluations, not just the number of evaluations that have been completed
so a
and such, but
component of
also
PIP.
if there have been any PIPs and what the result was. You know,
Yeah.
that they were taken off the PIPs or they resigned or whatever, you know, however, without naming teachers, but just the.
Yeah, I don't see a problem with that.
Okay,
Our hope would be is that we don't have any, but
right.
it's part of a mechanism to help people too, so.
Right, it just gives us a more,
Come
a
on.
better picture of what's going on with evaluations. But otherwise, I think this looks good.
Mike, I had another question about how many evaluations are typically done annually?
So it varies. It really varies by year, and something that you know, that David has discussed, and I think we'll be looking at this when we sort of queue up our triage list there of when we prioritize the order of the evaluations to take place this early spring. You know, if you have, like David has said several times, if you have 7 retirements out of school, that's 7 new folks that need to be evaluated, right? So you have these sort of upticks that aren't always predictable and aren't evenly distributed across schools. So, you know, like on the order of 15 evaluations, I would say that's like a really rough average per school. Does that sound about
Yeah,
right?
no, I think it probably would be somewhere between 15 and 25, you know,
Right.
something like that.
So if you average 20, you're talking about 100 evaluations a year.
Yeah.
Right.
Correct. So I guess my question is, we're going to spend a lot of time getting out of the overdue evaluations and add to that any new staff. So are we going to just accrue
Perpetuate.
another, and we're going to have another 100 behind here that,
Well, we hope, again, as Mike has articulated, that with some of the process improvements, and I'll say some succinctness to the evaluation process, not jeopardizing the quality, we'll be able to kind of right ourselves is the hope, you know, get ourselves out of the kind of the perpetual issues.
Yeah, I'd say that that it's ambitious, to be honest, to just honor your question. I think it is ambitious. I'm guardedly optimistic about reaching that goal based on the support that we hope to get from the coverage, right? Getting a calendar of coverage so that principals have the whole day to dedicate to evaluation. A day, a month, say, by principal. Also the support from the tool that I was talking about that we're developing, which we hope will make the walkthrough option much more efficient and impactful. And then also I want to celebrate our new hires, our new assistant principal hires. Both John Craig at the high school and Dave Hyatt bring some really great expertise and energy around the evaluation process, and they're both part of that work group. And so they're really, I think, rolling up their sleeves and helping us get out of this backlog. So seems like there's some good momentum.
And from a process standpoint, I know we have been educated kind of on this Danielson model in the past.
Yep.
Is there an intent to, right now it looks like we are keeping the current process that is pretty intensive, time intensive, and a lot of preparation, and then adding to it these walkthroughs?
Great question. So just to clarify, and I'd be glad to, we're in the process of updating that pilot option, but either there are two sort of pre-observation, observation, and post-observation. Either the evaluator does that twice for teachers who are up for evaluation, or with this pilot, we're coming to the end of a 2-year process. You do one of those, so pre-observation and post-meeting, and then a minimum of 5 walkthroughs, each time giving formative feedback with a set instructional playlist or criteria. And so 5 short walkthroughs to replace that pre-observation and post.
So there is some modification of the existing process that frees up time,
Exactly.
redeploys it to the walkthroughs.
Exactly. So the walkthroughs would take the place of that second round of
Yeah.
pre-observation, formal observation and post-meeting.
And it may be premature to say, but does the working group feel like the pre-observation and post is a sustainable model?
That's a great question. I think we'll know more this year. I know that one thing that we learned from the pilot from last year, specifically from Holly Ruel and Lissa McDonald, is that the walkthrough is no stroll in the park either. It requires the evaluator to, what they were both doing was to go immediately back to their office, sit down and compose a thoughtful email of feedback. So even though the walkthrough is quick, in order to get sufficient data points, there's supposed to be 5 taking place. So just scheduling 5 visits to a classroom times however many teachers is an organizational challenge. And then to have the self-discipline and opportunity and mental space to write thoughtful feedback after each of those 5 visits is its own challenge. So that's why we're really hopeful about this tool. Again, the tool is not a silver bullet, but we think it can really help in that area.
Yeah, the tool is still, I mean, it's much more prompted. It still does allow for, a snippet of narrative, but it takes some pressure off to allow it to expedite. Is that fair?
Exactly. Yep.
Just a more general question about the evaluations. Is parental input taken into account, and I guess in high school level, the students' input, is that part of the process?
No, it's not at this time, the framework that we currently have. And again, the pilot changes, the kind of pilot that I stepped into when I started in this position, those changes were within our current framework. So it's still based on Danielson. It's still based on evaluator, teacher. It's not a 360 input like you're talking about. So changes to the overall evaluation process haven't been made at this time, and I think that would have to be looked at through the negotiated agreement.
They're informally used, administrators and teachers use those as a component of the program of studies,
For the student input?
That's right.
Right.
Yeah, so it's not that they're not used, but.
There's not a formal way
Not a
of
formal
parental
direct
or parental input, there's really not.
No, other than our, processes available to parents through, complaint process, communication with principals,
Right,
superintendent,
right.
school board members, et cetera.
I'd also just say that it's becoming a really common practice. More and more teachers are using exit cards to get feedback at the end of the week or at the end of a lesson from their students in almost real time.
Right.
So, so that's not part of the evaluation process, but it is, student feedback for teachers.
Right. All right, thanks.
Any other board questions?
So this is warned for action, Elizabeth, but again, you may not be ready to do so. this modification was to section policy 8. And so we're reporting, I'm reporting policy violation. And so it's really up to the board's
Does the
pleasure.
board have this in front of them?
Oh, right, yeah,
Yes.
treatment of
Mhm.
staff, yeah.
Yes,
And have we gone through,
we have
detail?
previously,
Yeah.
we have previously gone through, we did not, we purposely brought it back because of policy number 8. But it's whatever you would wish to do.
so did we actually take formal action on everything but that detail policy?
I don't think you did not go through all of the, you did not go, you didn't walk through the document.
Okay.
When you say policy, you mean number 8, you mean number 6?
No.
It's 2.2.
2.2.
And it's
2.2.
detail policy 8.
Wait, there's no 6.
I only have 6.
It's page 8.
Page
I'm
8,
sorry.
okay.
Did I say it
Yep,
wrong?
detail policy
On page
6.
8.
That is
Thank you.
correct, yeah.
I reversed
Page
6 in
8,
there.
policy 6.
Yeah.
So would the board's pleasure be that we, after this update on detail policy 6, that we go through and take action on policy 2.2, treatment of staff? Or would anyone want to take some time and review things? Put it on the agenda one more time?
Reasonable interpretation, adequate data throughout, but in compliance, no, by virtue of one of the 6 being non-compliant, and then deeming whether the compliance plan was acceptable. And that adequately addresses this, or are you then gonna keep bringing it back every?
Well, it would be reported as out of compliance
Mhm.
and inadequate data, but the compliance plan that has been discussed would be accepted
Okay, well,
until it's reviewed again.
Was-
Yeah.
right,
We-
yeah, well, seeing as the compliance plan isn't to bring it in until, 6, 7 months from now, maybe we should.
Well, again,
Yes, sir.
what Mike identified is that we would be doing some updates, along the way, right?
So-
But really,
I
up
would
to you.
consider this as the compliance plan details, more so. It should be, it should be attached to the 2.2, because, it gives dates and what you're planning on doing. So, if it was just what was in the report, that seems a little thin, but when you add this, it seems fine, at least to
And
me.
Martin, would you want to wait to approve this till the performance improvement plan data was reported as well?
No, I don't think that's necessary.
I think we should.
So it sounds like we're ready to take action? All right.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you have it in the
I
packet.
guess, I
So
don't know if we
let
should
me
have
walk
this all
through.
settled before we walk through it, but
Yeah.
could adequate data, I guess my thought was, we have adequate data to determine that we're not in compliance, I think you said,
That's right.
okay.
Yeah.
So there is actually adequate data, it's just that it's not in compliance by virtue, in other words, up at the
Yeah.
top, it's not in compliance by virtue of non-compliance on 6, in other words, you have to be 6 for 6.
Right,
Okay.
right.
It's an all or nothing here.
It's an all or nothing.
All right, so under policy 2.2, treatment of staff, I'll read the overall policy and then we can approve the individual detail policies. The overall policy is with respect to the treatment of paid and volunteer staff, the superintendent shall not cause or allow conditions that are untimely, unfair, undignified, disorganized, or vague. So detail policy 1 is operate within written personnel rules that clarify and define rules, rights, and responsibilities, and evaluation for staff that provide for effective handling of grievances and that protect against wrongful conditions such as nepotism and grossly preferential treatment for personal reasons.
Just one, but you said within, and we mean up to operate without.
I'm sorry,
We shall not
operate
operate
without,
without
yeah,
them.
operate without written, okay. So, thank you, Alex. Reasonable interpretation,
Yes.
adequate data,
Yes.
and in compliance.
Yes.
Detail policy 2 is discriminate against any staff member for non-disruptive expression of dissent. Reasonable interpretation,
Yes.
adequate data,
Yes.
in compliance. Detail policy 3, fail to acquaint staff with their protections under this policy. Reasonable interpretation?
Yes.
Adequate data?
Yes.
In compliance.
Yes.
Detail policy 4, allow staff to be unprepared to deal with emergency situations. Reasonable interpretation?
Yes.
Adequate data?
Yes.
And in compliance.
Yes.
Detail policy 5, fail to create a positive organizational climate conducive to achievement of the ends. Reasonable interpretation?
Yes.
Adequate data?
Yes.
And in compliance.
Yes.
Detail policy 6, neglect to provide meaningful and timely performance evaluations to administrators, teachers, and staff. Reasonable interpretation?
Yes.
Adequate data?
Yes.
In compliance. And compliance plan acceptable.
Yes.
So we'll attach the compliance plan to this, and as far as the overall policy goes, it sounds like yes on reasonable interpretation, yes on adequate data, no on compliance, and compliance plan acceptable. All right, thank you all.
Just put that right with it, actually.
Perfect. All right, you can move on to.
Okay, so moving on to talk with you about the Smarter Balance Assessment Consortium, or SBAC. And Mike is here to do that as well and walk you through. Unfortunately, you folks over here got to do a little neck turn. Sorry about that. It's also in your packet, and we do apologize. We did have we provided some additional information after the packet went out, which is by your place. But, so let me turn it over to Mike, and again, we want to leave you some time to ask questions as well.
Super. So the latest updated edition of the report here has, our district to state comparisons, has comparisons for all of our students to the economically disadvantaged, has a few pages on multi-year comparisons, and then it also has a cohort comparisons, which Superintendent Young told me would be good to include. So, so that's a fair amount of data. I've got.
Mike, one quick.
Yep, sure.
So this packet that's by your place replaces what's in there. Again, a lot of the same data.
Yep.
So just to, I'm sensing like people are wondering which one to be going on.
Yep.
So this one replaces, this one has some additional graphs that the other one did not have.
Exactly.
Yep.
Thanks.
Sorry,
Thanks for
Mike.
that clarification. So, I guess if it pleases the board, I'd like to just sort of walk through this and then try to answer any questions that arise as best I can. And then just a couple of caveats before we dive in. When we're looking at, disaggregated data, when we're looking, the smaller the group, like a cohort, or when we're looking at, economically disadvantaged students in a given grade, that's going to tend to be a much smaller group. And the smaller the group, the greater the variability. And so you're going to see more volatility in our district numbers than in the state numbers, which is a much bigger N size. And along the same lines, when we have overall to subgroup comparisons, we'll see much bigger swings in the subgroup because it's a smaller sample. So it's more subject to variability. So that's the first thing I just want to say as a caveat. Also, you should know that grade 9, it used to be grade 11 for the high school Smarter Balance Assessment, and that was changed last year to grade 9. And so the advantage is that we have, year-to-year continuity there. The disadvantage, of course, is we don't have like an upperclassman Smarter Balance Assessment, but I think for that we could start to look at our board scores and other metrics. The other kind of limitation to keep in mind is this isn't the entire curriculum, right? This is just English language arts and math. And so it's, when these are on the front page of the paper and all the importance, and these are important measures of our students' academic proficiency, but they should never be the only ones. And they don't even represent the entire curriculum. They represent these two important pieces of our curriculum. And when we recall our ends include disposition for lifelong learning, citizenship, and personal development, I've been speaking with Superintendent Young about our need for other metrics. And so maybe next year we could consider looking at the Gallup survey, student survey, which is a poll which is norm reference. National has a huge N size that takes into account aspirational development, entrepreneurship, social belonging, to start collecting better data towards those other ends, because we have 4 after all, 3 beyond our academic proficiency. So just trying to kind of put this into perspective and to give it the proper context. And the last thing I'll say is that this district should be really, really proud of these results. And so with that, we'll kick off the slideshow here. This is this first slide is just looking at our district, how our district did compared to the state. And you can see, you know, again, you're going to see over and over again that our district performed at a higher level than the state. So this is for math. And this doesn't show sort of approaching proficiency. These are just, it's a binary measure, right? It's either met or didn't meet. So this is percent of students who met proficiency, met or exceeded, I should say. And so this is English Language Arts, ELA. And these are from last spring. These are 2018 results from this last spring. Again, seeing some really high scores. Moving to the next slide, we see a comparison within, this is just South Burlington students. The column in the middle there, SBSD overall, that's the entire student body. And then on the right, you're seeing at each grade level how students who are economically disadvantaged performed. And I guess on this slide, it's notable that there's one place where the economically disadvantaged group outperformed overall. So it's just making note of that. And then on our next slide here, we have English Language Arts. Yep.
Make light of that. I mean, that's,
Yep.
we want all children to be successful. And our desire is to have programs, as you heard from Holly earlier, that we're helping kids to belong, support, and get the support that they need to be successful. So, I mean, ideally, we would love to have, high achievements on those areas. Sorry, Mike.
Yeah,
You know.
I don't know when you want questions or comments. I mean, that 1 year is great, that 6th grade level, but this to me reads like a pretty big achievement gap between the kids who are economically disadvantaged and the district overall, and that's a concern. That's a big concern for me.
But you're referring to the math page?
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Yep.
And you look at grade 8, 61%
Right.
and 20%.
You're going to get into the cohort one, and so maybe, I don't know, Mike, we
Right.
either entertain that now, but when we get into the graphing cohort analysis, that might be.
It might be easiest for folks to, maybe we could go all the way through, and if folks
Yeah.
want to take notes
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
then
It's
save their
awesome.
questions for the end, then I can come back to the slides that you're interested in revisiting. So that was the economically disadvantaged in math. Again, this is just this year for ELA. And again, this is really useful when we're thinking about, okay, how well are we doing for our most disadvantaged? And I think, I don't want to speak on behalf of my colleagues, but I think in the short time I've been here, I think there's an awareness that we need to do better, and that we need to redouble our efforts when we're thinking about equity. So this next slide is a 3-year comparison. This is not a cohort, so this is just looking at the grade 3 scores 3 years in a row. So those are different students coming through grade 3, but it's interesting to look at. And next we have in ELA. And then we have these next ones, and I apologize, we kind of had to combine some some graphs from our spreadsheet with some text boxes and PowerPoint, so I apologize for some formatting things here. But this is a cohort report, and so you can see this would actually be this year's 7th graders who took, who are in grade 6 at the time of the spring 2018 Smarter Balance assessment. And then it goes back, for as long as we've had Smarter Balance, actually, it goes back 3 more years, all the way back to when they were in grade 3. And so it's interesting to see, the ups and downs of a cohort making their way through the system. So that's this year's 7th graders. And then our next slide is this year's 8th graders. Again, I guess I'll just repeat, because we're looking at a cohort here. Again, the smaller the number, the more variability we're likely to see. And then the next one here is this year's 9th graders, who last spring were in grade 8. The orange bar on the right is Vermont. The blue bar is South Burlington. And then our last slide is bringing it all the way to this year's 10th graders, who took the Smarter Balance last spring when they were in grade 9. First time we've had grade 9 for Smarter Balanced, and so then it allows us to have this 4-year cohort comparison. So with that, I think we should maybe open it up for comments and questions.
Can I ask a quick question before we start asking more detailed questions? Could you say a word about what proficiency means? And
Sure.
and who's included and who's not included, and what exactly it means to be proficient
Sure.
according to the test?
So, I think you're going to hear more than one definition of the word proficient, even around our state, in the middle of this big shift towards proficiency-based learning as required by our educational quality standards. When we say proficient here, there's a grade level expectation that is linked to the Common Core state standards. And it's fairly rigorous. It's not a shoe-in by any means. So, the Common Core state standards are rigorous grade level standards. And so these results say the students, they talk about making claims based on the raw score. And based on the results, they make a claim that the student is proficient, able to do those things as detailed by the Common Core in math and ELA.
And my question, I guess, is use the expectation. So these kids are taking these tests sort of in the middle of the spring. Is that the 3rd graders trying to reach proficiency on the 3rd grade levels, or is that the 3rd graders trying to reach proficiency on the previous year's levels? Like, which levels are they looking for in this test? Are they looking for levels that are at the end of the year that they may not be meeting anyway? Yes.
So it's the grade 3 level, and there's a fair complaint to say, well, grade 3 is not done yet. There's still more weeks of school ahead. A couple of things that you may already know about the Smarter Balance assessment. It's computer adaptive testing. So if you have a hard question and you get it right, it will give you a harder question. Mm-hmm. So they're able to sort of zero in with greater confidence about what the student can actually do as it relates to the test items. Conversely, if you get a relatively easy question, you get it wrong, you get an easier question, and it kind of keeps zeroing in. So it uses computer adaptive technology for greater accuracy. And then also you don't have, the number of items can be reduced in any given area because you're not trying to just cover everything. You can kind of zero in on the zone of proximal development of the student. So that's something that's important when we think about students sitting through long assessments. So that's the first thing to know about it. Another thing is it can be done in several sittings. So there are sections that need to be completed at each sitting. But students and teachers are allowed to, test administrators, teachers for the most part, are allowed to bring students back for a next round. So it can be done in smaller chunks, spread out over a longer period. And I'd say that could be a double-edged sword because sometimes it makes it a little more informal. Mm-hmm. But the idea is that we're not crushing our young people with, 2 hours of sitting time. So those are some of the advantages to the Smarter Balance assessment. It's supposed to make it a little bit better than NECAP, which also was assessed typically in April or May. So you had that same still another 6 weeks or 2 months of school problem.
So Mike, I do just want to clarify, because one part is computer adaptive and one part
Thanks.
is not on each of the ELA and that. So there is a portion where students are doing research and writing.
Yes.
That is not computer adaptive, it's a straight third grade task.
Right.
They're reading, doing research and having to write. And then there's also a math, I'm blanking on the name of it, but it's a pretty big problem-solving task that they need to do. And that is considered, like if it's third grade, it's a third grade math level task with multi-steps, and that is not computer adaptive.
So thanks, Holly. So there are basically two big parts. There's the computer adapted part, and then there are these performance tasks, which are supposed to be a little closer to real life learning in the classroom.
Maybe I think what I was just seeing in the patterns is that the math and the ELA seem to be correlated. So if the kids, I mean, just looking in those charts, in the blue columns, we went up in grade, and I can't read grade 6. 7 is up,
Yeah.
8 is down, 9 is kind of level on the ELA and down. But even if you toggle back to some of the earlier
Yep.
charts, it does seem like the math and the ELA performance is correlated. It's
Yeah.
not intuitive to me why that would be.
Right. So typically, we're going to see higher scores in ELA than math, and that's a much longer conversation that we could have some time. But there are a number of kind of hypotheses around why we see that. But yeah, you're right. They do kind of, even though typically ELA will be higher than math, we do with a cohort, we do see them kind of ebb and flow together.
Yeah.
That's a good observation.
It's not
Well,
obvious
I
to me
think,
why
I think
that
it's
would
also
be.
fair to talk about, curriculum sequencing and when kids are provided certain information in correlation to the assessment that's testing them, right? And so, if in a grade jump, you haven't gotten to the same material that the assessment is giving, and the assessment's more difficult, typically as we make the transitions, are likely possible areas. I think the calibration component, though, is, all Vermonters, again, it's a bigger N size, but those are some of the things that I think are important. And why, for us, right down to the classroom teacher, having the ability to know most specifically about how the student or my class is doing or the student is doing is critically important to me adjusting, the pace of my work, of my instruction in the classroom. Typically, we haven't broken down a lot of our cohort over time, and this is, again, getting at where we think we need to be more informative, again, at the building level, and ideally right at the classroom level where you're able to use it to your benefit.
Are there any?
There's also a lot of reading in that, especially on this test when you're thinking about directions and word problems.
Okay, so that would be a reason why they're correlated, or that would be one rationale.
The performance task, there's quite a bit of
Okay.
reading that they have to
Okay.
do as well.
Mike, I have one more question. I noticed that the 15-16 year, South Burlington did especially well compared to the following 2 years. Any insights on that? At least
See if I can find,
in
are we ELA or math?
math.
Math and looking at grade.
This page,
It's looking at
all the
grade.
grades.
All the grades, really. Yeah, I was going to ask a broader question to start with before we honed in on that one, which is what trends you saw in here, and were there any that concerned you or anything that you thought was positive? I mean, the math one, for example, really stuck out to me, and one
Right.
question I had was when we put in the new curriculum, and that's more a question for you because you've been here, David, through that. I know we put in bridges at some point. From a layperson, reading this, it doesn't look great. So the question is that something we should be concerned about, or, is there how are we assessing
Right.
specifically the curriculum, and is it a curriculum issue, or is there some other issue? So for example, I think part of my bigger question was, and I didn't really specify, but are we seeing a higher incidence of special needs and special challenges? And are all the kids taking the test, or are some kids excluded from the test? Like, what exactly is the data capturing? So is it just curriculum or
Right.
teacher performance or other factors? Like, what are we really seeing in these numbers, or
Totally.
what do you see when you look at these numbers as someone who has done this
Right.
year after year?
So I think you've raised at least 4
15
hypotheses. I
questions.
think there.
Sorry.
And I think they're the same ones I'm wondering about.
Okay.
And so when you start to see a multi-year trend, it doesn't mean that your new curriculum is not doing what it's supposed to, but it's worth looking at. And like you said, I mean, there are so many different variables and factors that are going to go into the score. And even, as Steve pointed out, when we see sort of this ELA and math going up and down together, to me that speaks to a student's or even a group of students' experience in school, right? It seems to be less about math or ELA and more about maybe student engagement at that point. And to get at that, maybe we need some student engagement data and some different tools to look at that as well. So yeah, that's a question that, if I see a multi-year trend, if we see, kind of math going down at the same time that we're implementing a new curriculum, is that, the aches and pains of implementing a new curriculum and the professional learning that needs to kind of get in place, or is it not doing what we want? And so I think of these as more sort of guardrails. And so when we see scores that are really high, that's great. And also when we see scores that are particularly low, that's, it's a red flag for us to think about. So, and then the other thing too is always, I think, to be looking over for these wider societal trends, when we're talking about the opiate crisis, when we're talking about rising inequality in our communities, when we're talking about families where parents can't help their kids with their homework because they're working 3 jobs, those factors are often reflected in the Vermont, right, swings. And so when we think about those wider societal factors, I think it's good to keep an eye on our Vermont numbers as well as our local numbers. So those are, you mentioned a lot of things that I'm thinking about when I look at them. No.
We do get, I mean, it's fair that we get back some additional data. I mean, this is not all we get back. When we get smarter balanced data back, there's some descriptives in there around kind of the areas that we're needing to be watchful. And again, then for us, it's about the professional learning and professional development, the training, as well as, just ensuring that there's some fidelity around the assessment.
Bridget, I can give you an example. We had 3 different intervention models in these 3 years. Guess which one we come back to?
Yeah.
That's what we
Yeah.
do as continuous improvement teams, is we look at the data and say, okay, what were we doing here?
Yeah.
Worked or didn't.
Differently. So and it's hard because there's so many factors that go
Right.
into it. It's not like we can only control one variable.
Right.
But this year, we went back to the model that we had in 2015, 2016, because we realized that our SDI scores look much better in that year. And I guarantee that that's going to have an impact right now.
Yeah.
I can't.
And we should also note that the Smarter Balance Consortium, Assessment Consortium, changed the form from 13-14 to, 14-15 to 15-16.
Yeah.
So that's the other side. When you look at multi-year data, you have to keep in mind that some years they change the form of the test or they change the items.
Stuart had mentioned that before, that it's been
Right.
challenging as we've taken it on because we haven't had so many years of having everything the same in terms of the test itself and how it's structured. One bucket of questions, and I won't beleaguer it, but we had talked previous years about comparing elementary schools, and we had seen more data on how each elementary school was doing. And then one thing we had asked for in the past, and I'm not sure that we've been able to follow up on it, is tracking cohorts through which elementary school, how they tracked through middle school and high school, and whether we're doing which, at the same job at all the schools, or whether one school's doing better. So for example, are there interventions that are happening at Chamberlain that could be, because I know the most recent one, my memory is that Chamberlain was doing better in math, for example, than the other two elementary schools. And are there methods already in place that are taking those learnings and spreading them to the other two elementary schools when one school's outperforming, or how are we working as a team to sort of look at those data school by school and how those kids are tracking through the rest of the system to take that back to what we could be doing differently in the elementary school level.
Great. So yeah, I think a lot of what you just said sounds like a good idea to me. I think that a couple of serious caveats around disaggregating by school. One is the idea around teacher beliefs and actually community beliefs around their school. And I'd hate to see any of the schools in this district adopt a negative, like we're the low scoring school. So I'm just going to be totally honest about that, because that very often becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And now that we're out of the No Child Left Behind regime, where there's a lot of, that's one of the most significant changes from NCLB to ESSA, is this, this not trying to label schools, which then can send them into kind of a spiral, because, imagine the morale and imagine the students. From a data standpoint, again, you're just going to, the smaller the group, the more the variability. So here we're looking at some decent N sizes, and we can see some good swings, and we're making hypotheses, and I think that's healthy. And the smaller you go, the more dangerous that game is. So that would be another thing that I would say. And I think there would be a strong temptation to make sweeping generalizations about this school or that school, and that could really stick and then have unintended consequences. The other thing, too, is that as far as subgroups, for example, economically disadvantaged or students on IEPs, we likely wouldn't be able to look at those subgroups at all, because as soon as the N size is like 10 or under, you can't report. The state won't collect or report on that data because of the danger of identifiability. Right. So all of a sudden you lose your subgroup data. So then you get into this school v. school type thing. As far as like tracking, like longitudinal tracking into the high school, when I think about just my professional experience, how much work we put into like, okay, we all came from different schools, but we're all part of the same community. And then, so that longitudinal tracking would kind of fly counter that and perpetuate the, you're in 10th grade, but you're still a Chamberlain kid or something. And we were joking about that, right? And if that's a point of pride, I think that's awesome. If we're talking about learning in 10th grade and trying to attribute lasting effects to things that happened 4 years ago, really tricky.
Plus, was that 10th grader a Chamberlain kid since kindergarten, or just since 3rd grade?
Right.
Yeah. Complicates, right?
Right.
I mean, I think, the grain size for the community and the board, I mean, it's important that that we're mindful of looking at the data and reporting and what are some things that we notice that's happening and why is that, and tell us what's going on, and learning together around either the instruction that's being delivered in a certain grade, what have we done for professional development in that school, principal expertise, et cetera, that we are asking those questions as we move. For instance, you talk about the implementation of bridges, how has that gone? How are we doing around kind of fidelity, with the implementation of that program?
Yep, and thanks, David, for bringing that up, because, there are other resources we can use besides this, high profile, front page of the paper, statewide, national data. For a lot of when you're talking about actually changing practice, a lot of times, whether, teacher walkthroughs and formative feedback and professional development work is more impactful, or some of the local assessments that are more formative and a little closer to the ground in the classroom.
Right. And the correlation maybe to those formative assessments to a smarter balance assessment that, you know, this was a point in time for a student.
Yep.
Could be outstanding and excellent, but maybe that's not totally reflective of their learning curve and what they need. So again, it all, I mean, we have a multitude of assessments that we do, you know, on students as we progress, but, you know, we need to, we can't shy away from this data, this is what's reported out, but how are we using it to continue to improve our practice?
Yeah, I think it's just been a little bit challenging because this is the data that the board sees, you know,
Yeah.
and we've been at Martin Elizabeth for many years, and me for the last couple of years have been asking for other assessments and other points of data, and it's hard because we just don't have a lot of ends metrics, frankly, that we see yet. So I think we might be a little more comfortable if we had those, but.
Fair, and we're just, they're coming.
Yeah, and I should say, Mike, not to say that the whole thing about the different elementary schools really comes out of a conversation that happened before you got here about consolidate or not consolidate those
Right.
elementary schools. And one of the big points of contention was,
Right.
are we treating students equitably across the
Right.
3 elementary schools, and how do we get at that? And if we had other data that could speak to that, we might be more comfortable with that. It's just a struggle because really, like I said, the core of the data that we get is really SBACs. And we know that doesn't tell us everything about what's going on in the schools, but we don't, as a board, I think, have a lot of insight other than that and our personal experience, which is, of course, anecdotal and relates to a small little, you know, circle of friends. So, yeah. So that's where those questions come
Totally
from.
appreciate that, yeah.
So I mean, there's a part of it as well is that I know there are community members who feel that airport noise and such at Chamberlain is affecting outcomes here, and to not have that data to be able to look and see whether in fact that is true. From what I have seen, I don't think it probably, I was just about to say, and what I've seen actually is it's not the case, but to have that data would be certainly important. The other question I had is just if you could comment on how this interacts with our proficiency-based graduation requirements, because when I look at the trend, you know, I'm looking at the 10th graders, by the time they get to a senior year, they're gonna be at about 20% proficiency if it was gonna. I was just gonna draw a straight line, which I know that's not good statistics, but I mean, could you just explain how this works in conjunction with the?
Sure. So, I mean, I would just go back to my earlier comment about, you know, math and ELA are really important in our curriculum, and they're not our whole curriculum. So to complement, you know, as additional measures, we need a really robust local assessment system. And that's really in the process of, you know, we're building the plane while we fly the plane. We're doing that thing. So I think, you know, the work at the high school is in high gear right now, looking ahead to actually graduating students based on evidence of proficiency. And when we say proficiency there, I think it means something a little different than when we say proficient here, because it's not against a norm-referenced exam. We're talking about proficiency in terms of preparedness, college and career readiness, the idea of competency. And so thinking of proficiency across the curriculum, so including science, social studies, and the other aspects of the curriculum, including transferable skills, which now start to get back to our other ends, right? These other ends that we tend to forget sometimes, that have to do with the disposition for learning how to learn, these things that we know, communication skills, things that serve our students so well as they go from high school to college.
Not necessarily reflected in the SBAC.
That aren't. And so there's a complementarity there. And, but also when we say proficient there's not like a national list of items that we're referencing that to. That's a locally developed assessment system. Still, those standards still reference our national sets of standards, whether it's C3 for social studies, Next Gen Science,
Right.
ACTFL for language, ISTE for technology. So they're still linked to those national frameworks for standards, but it's not like a norm referenced exam or test.
Thanks.
Just a couple of quick comments, Mike. as Bridget said, this is sort of what the board gets as a pretty concrete piece of evidence and data around how our kids are doing. And I appreciate that it's limited to a couple areas of the curriculum. I have always struggled with I'm looking at, 7 grade levels here and saying on average sort of 50 to 60% proficient, thereabouts. And then having a comparison to the state level where, as a state, we have some of the highest per pupil spending in the country, and going, I'm not sure if I'm supposed to feel really good and proud relative to the rest of the state.
In comparison to the
By
rest.
comparison. And then, we've gone through sort of a list of challenges and caveats with interpreting the data. I always do take your word and Stuart's previously that you should feel proud
Yeah.
in this. And I always get a better understanding of why this isn't, 64 isn't a C or a D when you're looking at
Right.
assessment. The trending over 3 years generally would concern me. I mean,
agree.
whatever the measurement mechanism, to see that kind of trending down generally is alarming. I think the performance gap selectively is pretty alarming as well, in terms of the socioeconomic, students we serve. But this is really hard to take to the community and sort of explain how well we're doing. And that's kind of, at the end of the day, what the challenge is sort of take this standardized testing where the references are actually statistically valid, and really explain, here's where we're doing really well, and here's where we see some areas, and I think you kind of asked the question around trending or observations. And then Holly left, but Holly gave some good examples of how some specific decisions were made at this school based on those observations that do impact the students here and parents here, that where they might have seen a couple of different ways things were done, and then they're going to see something, their child might be in 5th grade and they saw something different in 2nd grade. So that, I think, is the challenge of these standardized tests. And again, I'm going to take your word for it. There's a lot of concerns around how we take this information to the community in a meaningful way.
So I thank you I share your concerns. So something I think about is, when we see a score in the mid-70s, we're like, wow, that's great, and that typically compares really favorably. But so if you have a 75% meeting proficient, that means a quarter of your students aren't meeting proficiency.
Right.
So as soon as you flip that, all of a sudden there's cause for concern. And then again, as soon as we start to see scores in the 50s, that's another one. So I think that this is, I think we are seeing wider societal trends in the data when you look at the statewide data, as well as some trends. When we look at the cohort trends, I notice that sometimes we'd see these big swings and they'd kind of get back to where they were 4 years prior, and that was reassuring to me. Because there are good years and bad years in adolescence, and there are cohort effects, and there are things going on at the school that are different from one year to the next, as Holly pointed out. But that was when I actually looked at the cohort data, that was a little reassuring. That was reassuring to me to see that, for better or for worse, and I'm not saying that I'm satisfied with those results, but there seemed sort of like a return to almost where you could draw a line through the variability. The other thing too is when you're looking at swings, it's plus or minus 2 points, right, each time for margin of error. I think for grade level, typically you're going to be plus or minus 2 points on a given thing. Subgroups, it's going to be smaller group, so greater margin of error. So, when you see 2 points, even 3 points, it's really important to not make grand conclusions. So, like you, I'm thinking like, okay, we're super happy that we have 3/4 of our students, at proficiency. What are we going to do about the remaining 25%? And when we look at, you know, in some areas, there was one score that's like 20%. Maybe that's, that could be like 7 students, right? That subgroup. But to me, that's just a reminder that, you know, we're here for all students. Our purpose statement and our mission is not overall how we're doing. It's, and I hear you speaking to that, Elizabeth, it's, are we really doing the best we can for every single one of our students? So I think at the very least, this is a great reminder of that. I think, you know, we have to be careful with swings, not to jump to conclusions. But this is, I think of this data as sort of guardrails for our community. And again, we have plenty to work on. I think, you know, if we think about math, for example, which traditionally lags behind, a lot of times in elementary schools, math is taught less often. There are just fewer instructional hours devoted to math. And so doing, looking at using, if part of your question is what's next and what can we do, I would look at, well, how are we using the interim assessments towards Smarter Balance? If we really want these scores to improve, thinking about our community, but also thinking about how our students are doing. How are we using interim assessments that come with this assessment, if at all? Right now, I don't think they're used widely. And if they are used, they're not being uploaded into our system because Meg and I checked and they're not there. So, so that could be something. Doing sort of like a math audit in Montpelier. I actually commissioned a consultant to come in and do a literacy audit of our elementary school. And she found wide, you know, big surprise, wide variability in the way literacy was instructed, and that allowed us to move forward and build common practice. You know, first of all, what are the number of contact hours for math? A lot of teachers find it easier to, let's have 15 minutes of silent reading, then quick, let's do a 15-minute activity with Cuisinart rods. Just that it's not a natural, many of our elementary teachers, I don't mean in this district, I mean just in general, you know, go straight to story time before they would go to like a math activity, a pickup math activity. And so there's a slant there that's cultural about our own sort of math mindsets and ease with math.
Well, I think teachers being comfortable with the math content in general
Totally,
as we've made
yeah.
the transition. That's also been an area, and that part of our focus with our math coaches who are higher level math to help share and help, you know, classroom teachers be more aware of that. You know?
Yeah.
Well, I think this is really, it's great discussion, great questions. We're not done. As you continue to look at it and have questions, this is going to be back in front of you again as we continue our work with kind of our ends metrics as well. I know we're running a little behind here, so.
Sorry, one last question on this. You know, we do have the South Burlington compared to the rest of the state, but are there other states that we could compile together? No, I don't want to pile more work on your plate,
Yeah.
but it would be good to see how Vermont is doing against, you know, compared to
great question.
the rest of the country.
Right.
And I'm not assuming that all other states use the SBAC.
Right, they don't all use it,
That's right.
but there are a certain number that
Number
do.
that
The
do.
other one is the PARC, which is the other Common Core sort of consortium. I don't have those at my fingertips, but I'd be glad to look and then to follow up with Superintendent Young if I can find them to provide that comparison as well.
Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, moving on. Again, great questions. Appreciate it. Thank you, Mike. Moving on to the Youth Risk Behavior Survey. This is also placed at your side, so this is like going to give your eyes trouble. I'm going to personally thank Delina. I did not delegate. I went through and looked at, and it didn't sound very smart, but there was no way to take the executive summary and to combine these onto the executive summary, which I'll give some feedback to the Vermont Youth Risk Survey folks. But so what you find here is where there is current data, they will often make a connection, like under personal safety and violence. You'll see in 2017, they'll give you some data. And so in this particular case, students were less likely to have been bullied at school. You see 45, people with me? 45 versus 47. 45 is 2017, 45 is 2017, 47 is 2015. Right above that, Delina entered the number for me, 38 versus 37. You see that? So we, yeah, so we've tried to combine, because to go between this one and the other was, we felt was going to be really confusing. Specifically, in an overall, there's a lot of data here. A quick general observation, and what I would say some concerns. First is the middle school. You know, I would say I'm concerned about mental health. Particularly, any percent there is a worry. So I'm on the bottom of that very first page, you know, looking at,
Percentage for that?
yeah, so, yeah, and I didn't, yep. So the first is, I only have for the second bullet point, Martin.
Yeah.
So 18% of middle school students have seriously thought about killing themselves. 12% have made a plan. That 12% for SB, 9%. Follow me?
Yeah.
And then made a plan about how they would kill themselves, and 6% have tried, 3% for us. So when I think about that, this is a general overview, big concern, you know, that we have from this. And again, this is something as administrators, we're, again, part of the things that you're hearing about. Page 2, top on substance abuse, you know, again, this is about the vaping, specific to kind of the requests from the board. Again, I don't have significant concerns here, given the data points. So again, that's a quick review of middle school. Moving to page 3, and again, I'm gonna wanna let you folks come back to whatever you see. Page 3 at the high school, I think, you know, mental health, similarly, there's some concerns there related to the same issues that I just talked about, kind of under mental health. All 3 of those bullet points are concerns. Moving on under the substance use / tobacco, you know, I think we've made some gains in the area of just tobacco and cigarettes. But I think, as noted, you can see some current usage of the vaping particular situation there, which is in the second and third bullet point highlighted at 26, 28 over that course. So again, those, when you take the high school, kind of 900 students and rough, and you do some, you know, percentage applications, there's some numbers of students there that are concerned. So those would be kind of my quick highlights there. I think on page, not seeing the page number on the next one, page 4, last page, under sexual behaviors specific to kind of condom availability, condom usage, and that you see where that is under the second bullet point, and under sexual behaviors. Students were significantly less likely to use a condom. You see the state numbers 17 and 15, and then ours 61 and 20 and 62. I have a whole lot of other information. Again, this boils down into, has other collection points, but those are some of the quick high points for the board.
And these are biannual, right?
These are, that's correct, yep. So 15, 17, there'll be another one, 19, yep.
So would that be this school year?
No, that would be next year.
Okay.
Yep. So I don't know what other questions you want to have. I know this is connected to some of the inquiry that board had specifically to me. This was my approach to that. I did not think it would be, although you did get it, I did not think it would be great to try to discern from this. So this was my approach, to kind of go from an executive summary and just pull some of the data out for you.
Yeah, David, thank you for this.
Well done.
Go ahead.
No, I just.
Okay, I was going to say, yeah, I mean, to say that the middle school cigarette use is, what, 2% or what, 4% or 5%, you know, that's good that it's down to that number, but, you know, these kids have 4 or more years of school before they graduate. And if they end up graduating with a nicotine addiction, they're going to have a tough time in college, where they're going to be faced with smoke-free campuses in which they are basically going to have to go through withdrawal in order to go to school. And there's also employers that are going to want to hire people that aren't going to be taking these breaks because they have to. So, it starts out in middle school at, 4%, she noted. But then when it gets to high school, it gets much higher. And every kid that graduates with a nicotine addiction has a huge burden that they have to overcome. And, they're basically starting out in life 2 steps behind in their careers, whether it's college or their job. It's a big problem. And
Yeah, no,
You know-
I'm not wanting,
Oh, yeah.
any percent that's in there, is attached to a student.
yeah, I mean, this,
So to say that I'm not concerned would be wrong. When I look at targeted resources specifically,
Yeah.
from the school perspective, in addition to what we're doing, I think it's right that we're talking about it, highlighting it, and looking at all of the dispositions. But I'm not, what I mean by, I'm not like looking to put, high dollars into, to try to
Yeah.
resolve that one thing.
oh, I know.
But don't let it be confused with, I don't care about.
Oh, right. I'm not saying that we should be putting money towards it, but we should certainly be talking about it, because the trajectory of a kid who graduates from high school with either vaping or cigarette addiction
Yeah.
is just not as good, and the data bears that out.
Yeah, no question, and I think, particularly for me, there may be other factors associated.
Oh, yeah.
With behaviors, right? And I think it's critically important, again, to come back to mental health. We've had
Yes.
some, we've just, tonight is a tough night for the folks in BFA as a result of a suicide.
Oh, I
And we've got
didn't
our
know.
neighbors not too far to our south who've had one recently as well
Yeah.
at Mount Mansfield just this last week too. So, there's some really, really a lot of sensitivity to what are we doing, not only as a school, but as a community, to make sure that there's places for our students to seek out and get support, and feel, connected. And we clearly have work to do. But again, I think, not really fair to you to get it. We probably, should do another, bring it back, what other observations. I'm sorry to, flood you with it. This, I felt the executive summary was probably the right way to go. Those of you who are interested, I did send you we have the links. I also have a copy of the actual assessment that was given. I'm happy to, do whatever you wish to do. Again, this is important data that we use.
So, I would like to see a follow-up, and we can put it on a future agenda of how we are addressing the mental health issue and what we're doing generally about the substance use. Some of the trends look good as far as substance abuse, the decrease in alcohol consumption. I'm just looking at the high school, though there are 2 troubling trends. They're not huge percentages, but important, the increase in marijuana usage and the increase in vaping. Just to understand what is being done. I know that we have folks that deal specifically with substance abuse, but if we can get a report on those 2 issues, maybe we can just put it on on the future agenda items. I think that'd be helpful. Given this data,
Yep.
what's the state of what we're doing in the schools?
Any other questions or comments? All right, we're a little bit behind, but we will move on to agenda item 9, master planning and visioning.
So, Roberto Fitzgerald is here with us from Dor Whittier. Roberto, come on up. I'm a little tongue-tied here at the moment. Too many R's or
Is he
whatever.
related to you as well? I didn't ask that before.
I think he disclaimed it in one presentation.
Oh, okay, all right.
I have a thumb drive.
Right there is the computer. There may be a memory stick in there already, but. So, not like I want to fill the void, but just to give a little bit of update. Last board meeting, we shared with you, Bridget and I did a little bit of a, kind of a quick share about our off-site school visits. And then also following that was the Shelburne visit, some of the takeaways, the feedback that came back from our visiting group, inquiries, questions, things that we felt were good, things that we felt that, were concerning to us. Those all filtered back into, through Dor Whittier. We have Principal Workshop 2 coming up next week. Tuesday, yeah, with both the high school and middle school principal and some of the other folks that they're pulling in to, again, talk more about where they are. And again, this is all leading towards kind of a February goal of getting some additional and specific direction from Dor Whittier on our behalf. So tonight we wanted to just walk you through, I forget how many slides you said, Roberto?
Roughly 20.
20, so
Should be
we-
about 15 or 20 minutes.
Yeah, so again, likely you'll have a lot of other questions after too, but again, again, the purpose of this is to really keep people informed, also, most importantly, board, but community members as well. Thanks.
Yeah, so thanks for having me today. Tonight's presentation is a very short synopsis of where we're at this point. It's not intended to be, a lengthy overall summary of what we've done. It's kind of just a snapshot. So there's probably a lot of information that I won't be covering today, but it will all come out when we complete our study, and we'll share more information at our next presentation that we give you. So tonight, going to go over, basically the overview of the entire feasibility study, educational space analysis, some of the work that we did and that we reported out during the visioning sessions. Summary of findings is it's not the total summary of findings. It's just, like I said, it's just a snapshot of some of the top items that we've reviewed, and then the next steps. So when we look at the overall feasibility study, you can see in this lower track here, this is work that we did starting back in November of 2017. That was completed in April of 2018, and that was essentially the existing buildings assessment. We've reported out on that for both the middle school and the high school work. So that's out there and available to the public. This upper track here is the track that we're on currently, which is the educational analysis and planning. We began this in September of this year, and we're working towards completing this phase by the end of December. At that point, we'll begin putting some design options together based on the information from the existing buildings assessment combined with the educational analysis and space planning. We'll start that process. We'll put together a series of options ranging from strictly renovations and infrastructure items to renovations and additions to new construction. So you'll see the full spread of options. And then we'll put some cost estimates together and with an independent cost estimator, and we'll present that in February, and then that way you've got enough information to make some decisions on how to move forward. So in this educational analysis and planning section of our study, we first started off, we formed a working group made up of administration, principals, and some students. We went through a series of interviews with the principals and some of the key department staff, identifying their current conditions and practices. We looked in depth at each of the schools, the middle school and the high school, in terms of their space needs and in a few different ways. We held a community visioning workshop made up of approximately 80 people from all facets of the community, including students from both the middle school and the high school. We went on some school tours about 6 schools, I believe, a mix of both middle schools and high schools, so that I can't remember how many people there were on that trip, but there were maybe 15 or so.
15 on the Massachusetts trip, and I didn't count on Shelburne. Yeah.
And that was essentially to, see what else is out there in New England, what's working, what's not working, what are people's perspectives in relation to what we have here in the South Burlington School District. And up ahead, we are going to be doing a second round of principal interviews, and this is looking more at their organizational structure and their future ways that they really want to organize their school and identifying their needs. Then we'll begin putting together conceptual options and cost estimates, identify the priorities as, that's an important item. I think, as we've talked about in the past, is really honing in on what is the most important, because we all know that you can't afford to do everything. And then publish a final report in February of 2019. So where did we start? We first started looking at, well, what type of guidelines does the South Burlington School District use in putting together their curriculum? And universal design for learning is what was presented to us, providing multiple means of engagement, multiple means of action and expression, and multiple means of representation. This is what each school uses as their guidelines for putting their curriculum together. So in talking about the district ends policy, this forms the basis for, again, how we view each of the 2 schools. So you're looking for students that are lifelong learners, that have a certain level of academic proficiency, that have personal development through the course of their years here, and become good citizens in their communities. And the expectations are that you want students that are clear and effective communicators, that are independent and have self-direction, that are creative, that they can solve problems on their own, that they're responsible, involved citizens, and that they are an integrative thinker. They integrate multiple ideas together, and these are much different than what the guidelines probably were back in 1967 or 1960s when these buildings were built, right? So when we look at the Tuttle Middle School, for example, which was built in 1967, which is about 2 years before man landed on the moon. You look at the way the building is laid out, and essentially the building hasn't changed. Back then, the idea was, teachers are, teaching in front of the classroom. The students are in rows facing the teacher, and the teacher is giving a lecture, and the students are listening and memorizing, and so on. Those items that I just went over, they weren't discussing that. Today, it's much different. Businesses are looking for students that are collaborators, that are problem solvers, that are independent, that are good communicators. And so when we look at the layout of this building, for example, you see, all of the classrooms are in a row. This is the Library Media Center. This is the cafeteria and kitchen. Over here is the gym. Over here are what were some industrial art spaces, which are now art. So these are all we colored them according to, what their functions are. And then on the second level All the dark blue are all classroom spaces. This is all science in the center, and classrooms on the outer wing. So the majority of the classrooms are actually on the second floor. And band and music over here. And so, the original intention is that the building, teachers are kind of operating on their own, in their own classrooms, in their own space. Well, today, what we found through the principals' workshops and the visioning sessions and the discussions that we've had is that, they're not operating that way. They have teams. They have 6-person teams. And on those teams, there are 4 core teachers that are teaching the subjects, but they're all supposed to be collaborating together to promote collaboration and project-based learning with the students. But they're finding it difficult because the building layout is not laid out in a way to facilitate that sort of collaboration, both for teachers and collaboration with students. Special educator is the other person on that team. And they are located in various places around the building, little nooks and crannies. When the building was built in 1967, they didn't have special education. It wasn't something that was talked about. They were all sent to one part of the building, or it wasn't even an aspect of education. So, and you think about technology as well. There was no computers back then, and a whole myriad of other changes that have happened in education since then. So essentially what we found in this is that, the building is not flexible. It doesn't have those types of spaces to facilitate the project-based learning that's happening and trying to happen inside that space. So on the building capacity, we looked at the overall square footage of the building, which is about 120,000 square feet, in relation to Vermont standards for the number of students. Vermont says for the 550 students that you have, you should have 88,000 square feet. So according to Vermont standards, your capacity should be 753 students. Then we also looked at what Massachusetts, which is a neighboring state, what their standards are, and they say that, for the 550 students, you should have 98,000 square feet. And so what that says to us is that, you have a building in terms of the overall square footage that is a little bit large for the number of students that you have. And I think some of that's attributed, they may not feel that way because they're using the spaces that's available to them. And so if we break that down a little bit further, this plan shows it's color-coded according to space size. So the classrooms or any spaces that are less than the state guidelines are in red, which are these classrooms over here. Spaces that are yellow are about what the state guidelines say they should be, and spaces that are in green are in excess of what the state standards say they should be. So you can see a lot of the spaces like the cafeteria, the kitchen, the library, a lot of these spaces are oversized according to the state guidelines. Moving up to the second floor, you'll see a lot of these classrooms are actually undersized according to the state guidelines. And some of that is attributed to the special education integration, right? It's attributed to the technology integration. Those are things that require more space in the classrooms. The other thing that we found that was pretty significant is that about 50% of the building is all without any natural light. So if you look at all of these classrooms, which are all science classrooms on the second floor, all of these classrooms in the center here, the gym, the band and the music, all of these classrooms, these are all without natural light. And moving down to the first floor level, the entire library does not have any natural light. All these other spaces have no natural light. That was something that was pretty significant that I hadn't really realized even after walking through the building until we really kind of took our time and walked through and talked to some of the people there and realized, hey, this is a really significant issue. It's not just in some classrooms, it's 50% of the building. So summarizing for the middle school, really the 1967 building layout, as it hasn't really changed since then, it doesn't really support the 2018 curriculum that you have. You have teams that are trying to teach as teams, but they are not organized in a way that they can be cohesive. There's no identity that says, hey, this is our team. There's a lack of collaboration spaces for teachers, and for students to engage in those kind of project-based learning, to be integrative thinkers. There's, like I said, the 50% of the building without any natural light, and the undersizing of the classrooms. Meanwhile, the overall building itself is oversized for the population. So moving on to the high school, we did the same thing, same sort of look at the high school, and it's in some ways similar. This was built in 1960, at least this portion of the building here. This was a 1972 addition, and this was a 1972 addition. And really the building hasn't changed since then. And we really found similar themes in terms of, the way that teachers teach is that they want to collaborate with each other. They want the math and science to work together with the robotics guys. And, found that, over here, for example, was where the tech ed type programs are pretty far away from the science, which are actually on the second floor. This science is up on the second floor. And so, even programs that seem to make sense that they should be close together are not, just by physical barriers across the building. And then you have other teachers that want to integrate, for example, art is way down on this end. Well, you can't get down to this end unless you go through the gym. And so, that's a pretty significant problem, and a lot of people actually don't even know that whole wing is down there because, some students, just don't go down there. They don't have a class down there and don't even realize that, all of these classes are down in that section of the building.
I don't want to interrupt your flow, Roberta, but
Yep.
I did want to mention to you, something that was a little disturbing to me when I did the full walkthrough of the high school was that for certain students with physical limitations, they literally can't get from some parts of the building to other parts of the building without an adult with them who can unlock doors and take them through spaces that aren't normally used to sort of as walk-through spaces. So that was a bit disconcerting as well.
Yeah, accessibility is a significant issue at the high school in many different ways. They made a very big improvement by upgrading and inserting that elevator that helped quite a bit. But even that, there are still areas of the school where you just can't get to in a wheelchair. There's the band rooms as well, this whole area in here.
Multi-purpose rooms, this day, some of those areas just are not.
Right. This whole area down here as well. There's different levels. So, and then they are looking to have students that want to know what they're going to do for the rest of their life. This is a common theme that students that graduate from high school, a lot of them don't really know what they want to do. And so how do students figure that out? Well, you have them explore different things, explore their interests, start at an earlier age, at middle school and early, freshman years of high school. And how do we do that? Well, we collaborate with other teachers. We offer more exploratory ways for students to engage with the public, with businesses and so forth. These are the types of things that the school wants to do, is trying to do, is doing with some of their programs, but due in large part to the limitations of the building, aren't able to fully achieve those goals. And so, again, similar things of lack of collaboration, space, and disjointed spaces from one another from where the programs really make sense to be. So when we're looking at the building capacity, we are, it's a slightly different story than at the middle school. The existing square footage is about 158,000 square feet. Your current enrollment is 942 approximately. And in relation to the Vermont standards, it's difficult to read, but it's about 169,000 square feet. Massachusetts says with this population, you should have 186,000 square feet. So based on the Vermont standards, your current capacity is about 880. And this is just based on the overall gross square footage. And then when we dig deeper, you can see here in the red, again, our spaces that are undersized according to state standards. Your auditorium, many of the classrooms. The spaces in yellow are within the range, and the green are in excess. So, your library is a little bit larger than what the state guidelines say. You go to the second floor, again, a fair amount of red. Physical education space undersized as well. So when we think about, all of the various issues, they start to add up when you look at the school in this light. So in summary, again, nothing's really been done to these buildings since they were originally constructed. The educational thinking is much different than what your current curriculum and visions and policies are for teachers trying to teach in these spaces. There's a lack of collaboration spaces for students and teachers. Their programs and departments are disjointed and separate. There's really very few spaces for teachers to get together and do collaborative planning. Classrooms are undersized. Meanwhile, the overall building is over capacity. And then I know this is difficult to read, but we also took a look at some enrollment projections. These are based back in December of 2017. They're in the process of being updated over the next couple months. And but generally speaking, we see a slight upward trend at the middle school and an upward trend at the high school over the next 10 years. So we talked about the steps that we've done are in the light gray here. We've just finished the school tours a couple weeks ago. Looking ahead, we have principal interviews next week. Then we'll begin putting together the options and cost estimates, identifying priorities, and then issuing our final report. We are hoping to have a number of public informational sessions where we'll be getting feedback and so forth along the way, and we'll continue to report out to you as we go.
Are not sort of on the subcommittee, that principal interviews aren't just interviews with the principals themselves. They're more like workshops where the principals have drawn together faculty and students to give input at each of the schools. And then a couple of the school board members and some of the administration are also sort of sitting in on those and providing input and asking questions and things as we go along as well. So it's a pretty big group actually that's working at the middle school and high school, and these are sort of like full day 9 to 4 workshop days. So.
Yep. Thank you. That's exactly right.
So I don't know if, again, thanks for the overview. For some of you, it's like you've heard it before. Again, for the public, if they're watching and want more information, we encourage them to reach out to us. We've got a lot of information on the web. But more importantly, just trying to make sure people are updated around where we are in the process. Certainly, school board meetings are an appropriate place. We've been trying to be mindful about keeping just some updates on here. This is a little more than that, because we've done a fair amount of work as a result of our time. So I don't know if any board members have any other questions for.
Just a quick one, are the building graphics available on the website at this point? Because I think that's a pretty telling story, just
The highlighted.
dealing with capacity and dealing with utilization of the current facilities.
Yeah, I believe they are, Elizabeth. I mean, I don't know necessarily about these, your more recent slides here, probably not, but I think we have the same, I can't do exact graphic comparison, but you've provided the kind of capacity.
Yeah,
Colors.
we had these slides in the visioning workshop, and
Yeah.
I think we were hesitant about publishing the whole visioning
Without having,
presentation without having the
Yeah.
kind of backup information in terms of explanation. And so we're in the process of having a visioning summary done, and I think that might be an appropriate time to issue this information along with that, so people can have the context. Oops, sorry.
thank you, Roberto.
Okay.
Any other board questions or comments? Oh, that's okay.
If I were to just say anything, I would keep in mind like enrollment in programs in regards to like the size. So like I saw that in one of your graphics that the Tuttle chorus room was marked as oversized compared to the state, but anyone that has been in the Tuttle chorus room when chorus is in session will know that it gets really full and really hot. I would just like to keep that in mind. And
Yeah,
Yes, that's a good point.
Yeah, and I had thought about adding too, so the Vermont state standards, we should be clear, are somewhat outdated. So the state has not had state-level construction funding or support for schools to build new buildings in several years. And so those standards haven't been updated in a while, the Vermont ones. And then the Massachusetts ones are interesting because they place different values sometimes on things. So it's going to have to be kind of an iterative process. It won't be just sort of trying to match exactly what the capacities are in those standards. It's going to be a big discussion about what our priorities are and what our faculty members think the needs are, what our community thinks the needs are, but the students, because we do have students involved in it as well. So it's not as easy as just saying, okay, here's the number, and we need to sort of meet that number. So for example, the Massachusetts state standards say that the gym at Tuttle is also the right size, that it's perfectly sized for the number of students we have, and anybody who's actually tried to like watch a game there or really use that space feels that it's undersized. So it's a little bit tricky process, and the architects are kind of leading us through that process and trying to draw out as much as they can from all of our input to make
Some
sure
of
that's
those-
going into that process.
Some of the state comparisons, it's hard to, unless you're in the community, where some Massachusetts, communities actually have performance areas or larger spaces for venues to play events, so their schools are not necessarily the places where they play the event, but they might be only the practice areas or the physical education spaces. So there's some differentiation that happens there, but I think absolutely accurate around kind of our outdated, in some ways, those standards.
Yeah.
Our fifth and sixth grade basketball players go over to the UVM and use
Yeah.
the facility.
Right.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up, because that is something I didn't mention, that those are, minimum guidelines, and that part of the process that we go through when we're putting together our conceptual options is, finding out what each individual school's actual needs are. Some schools have, very strong, vibrant, dramatic arts programs, and really need to kind of expand the absolute minimums to what they're actually needed for that particular school district. So we take all of that stuff into consideration when we put together concepts, and thank you for bringing that up. Anything else?
Thank you, Roberto.
All right.
Yep.
We'll move on to agenda item 10, budget planning.
So mindful we're running a little bit behind, Elizabeth. I think we can move through some of this pretty quickly because it won't be the first time budget's going to be in front of you. This first thing is that we did receive, late last week, I want to say, from the tax commissioner, information related to the homestead property values rate and items that are critical to, to be inputted into our budget development process. In addition, also the non-residential property tax rate. So, important, in context with budget update, direction from the board was really to look at kind of level funding, continued service. Again, continued service was be with the same staff that we have and moving things forward that way. And then a desired budget, things that are going to help us with the continuation of meeting our ends and some of the identified areas of, that are out there. So that's where we are. I don't know if there's specific questions that people, again, I did provide the board with the letter. I also have both Amity and Gary here if there's specific questions around anything associated with the tax, the information that came to you. Again, pretty hard to, again, the yield obviously creates more favorability to local tax for South Burlington. The things that we don't know yet, as obviously we don't know our equalized pupils. I talked a little bit about that earlier with the SLDS collection. And that's a big factor that will go into that as well. Obviously, the biggest factor is what we put in for increases or changes in our expenditure lines that are needed. I don't know, Gary, Amity, anything you wanted to add to reflections to the tax commissioner or anything you're hearing from colleagues?
Many numbers that are not solidified at this point in time.
So the yield numbers, I think, they tell us by inference that that the state is expecting, property values to be increasing and income to be increasing, across the state. I think that's part of the reason the income and the property yield went up. So I think we can expect, the potential CLA rate for South Burlington could go down a little bit. So those are kind of linked.
And the result of that is for the tax rate to go up and the CLA goes down, right?
Correct.
Okay.
So, kind of moving on to the budget update, unless, is there any other?
Just I mean, I'm sort of, we looked at 2 years of one-time spending too, so I'm trying to kind of comprehend that. I mean, there's a note in this letter that says, even though the rates are level, it doesn't mean bills will stay the same. And it's also looking at a projection of increase per pupil spending of 4.1%. So at some point, I would like to understand the reconciliation of the one-time spending and the level rates. But that can hold for a future discussion.
So if I can, we'll move on and to the budget update, highly correlated to that. But, we're going to do the very best we can, but as Amity said, we don't have equalized. And that's a big component of moving forward. And so we're going to do some guesstimation, but I don't believe it will be extremely valuable, probably, and accurate as we move forward. Most importantly is about what we're thinking about in our desired budget to continue to move the district forward. Those will be the conversations, I think, that you'll see coming out, That said, we'll have to value that against, the numbers that are coming in and what that represents to the taxpayers. So I don't know, Amity, Gary, anything else on kind of where we are? As far as the budget development process, we are moving forward, central office, folks have met and done have had some conversations around some things that we need to address. It's not always about adding more, but address. The principals, we've been meeting with them, we'll continue to do that. We met with the elementary folks, we'll be meeting with middle and high school, again, to talk a little bit more about what their needs are. So that's where we are. Citizen Budget Advisory is coming up again on Monday. So they're also a big part of the equation, and we'll be getting this information and also being able to provide some feedback. Okay. And the last is, and again, this is a very rough sketch, but I just wanted to, again, we wanted to be reflective of some of the feedback. Again, this resulted from feedback from the board around kind of changing this. So what you see here is, again, a really rough draft with older letters necessarily, but I think the table of contents is probably the most helpful, but identifying some correspondence from all of our schools, our administrators, and some of the things they're working on, kind of the simplified budget table, increases and reductions, student results, staff accomplishments and awards, letters from our various departments, Director of Learning, Director of Support Services, Director of Operations and Finance, some obvious budget information that's statutorily required, and then a little explanation, the primer, if you will, we're calling it, is on the tax rate calculation, and then what you'll actually be voting on. So again, this is just a compilation of some of the things that we felt were appropriate artifacts and that we'll include. Again, we're open to board reflections on whether that's kind of hitting the mark. I know board members have already provided that, but this is, again, a next step. The problem is, this always really happens fast, so, and I think we're worried about the state's ability to give us the detailed information on equalized. So, we can do a fair amount of the work, but, we're going to be, until we get that final, I think it would be remiss of us not to be able to articulate the actual overall expenditure effect on each taxpayer. So, I don't know.
Yes.
What part, Bob? Like the whole, anything that's, anything? The way they do that? I don't know. So where it's specific, again, I'm just going to go back to the table of contents, where it's specific to like the budget, is that what you like, budget information? Yeah, can we provide them? I don't see why we can't provide you with what we have. I don't know, again, I'd have to defer to both Amity and Gary around on the construct of that, but certainly the ability for.
You don't want to make it for everybody, you don't want to post it, maybe I could get a copy.
Yep.
Second.
You got to request that through a form.
Yep.
That's what you require.
Yep. Easy for me to say yes, but I put a caveat because. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So again, if you have other thoughts after this, feel free to get them to us. Moving on.
All right, legislative priorities letter.
So legislative priorities, again, this is back up again from the previous meeting. I think there was some additions, some feedback that came back. I think Martin brought back some of the changes. I know, Alex, you had maybe another question on one that the rest of the board probably isn't aware of maybe, but.
Yeah, sure. I was going to suggest, first of all, I appreciate having raised the tobacco sale age. That's kind of my favorite subject these days. Maybe it would be worth it to add a sentence, something like, studies have shown that students who graduate with a nicotine addiction, or however you want to put it, do not have have lower outcome or less successful outcomes than high school graduates that do not have that.
I just would be, I'd be cautious,
Yeah.
Alex, around, unless we can actually maybe point to a specific data point that you're talking about.
Yep.
I would advise the board not to be making generalizations. I mean,
Right,
I'm not,
Well, if you, I mean, you could say according to,
yes.
but
right.
I don't think we have that information available, but if you want to forward something.
I don't have, I think I might have the footnote in a
Yeah.
box at home with my older school board papers, but,
So I guess, I mean, if at all possible, I'd like to get this out earlier rather than
Yeah.
later.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
if there's,
Mhm.
if it's not a critical change, I'm hoping to keep it as close to this as possible, just so we can get it out.
okay,
So I think the timing is as important as anything, and if that's something we can, do without, so that I can forward this to Delina and Meg and have them send
All
it
right.
out as early as possible.
well, if it's urgent, let's leave it as it is.
And I know you had another question about Act 46.
Yeah,
And that, as far as, well, you go ahead and ask the question.
okay,
I'll-
I'm not aware of the connection between Act 46 and the Small Schools Grant. So I don't know if we should take that out or rename the heading of the
The-
first or the bottom paragraph on the first page.
Yeah, the small school grant and the so-called phantom students, they are kind of caught up in the Act 46 and
Yeah.
consolidation efforts. That's why I have it there to keep them focused on our position in that. And actually, Act 46 is one area that we're probably going to see a lot of potential suggested bills or bills that are coming from various people. So I would like to keep that part focused where that, because they are connected.
Okay, good.
Yeah, so,
And I was going to say on that, the Small Schools Grant, it might be $5 or $6 million. I'm not really sure.
yeah, it was 7 to 10 at one point, but I
Oh,
think it's
wow.
gone down. I think
Okay.
it is down quite a bit.
That's good. But the amount of money going towards phantom students is about, it's a lot more. I tried real hard looking last night at
Right.
the phantom students article. I did started with a Google search, as most people do. Couldn't find it, but I recall hearing that it's much more than.
I think
the
they all
amount the small
play, they all
schools-
play into the.
Oh, yeah.
Into the factors that I think that you've identified in this letter,
Yeah, and I think, my understanding is that phantom students are, I don't know if entirely being phased out, but that's part of the, is it entirely? Yeah, well, thank you. Yeah,
So the-
so and it's a
Definitely been-
process over a certain number of years with these consolidations, that is something that's supposed to be going away. That's
Yeah.
why all of the new districts are supposed to be right-sized, so you don't have to have phantom students. Well, one of the many things you don't have to
Yeah,
have.
Well-
it's also a component of, when there's major drop, right? When you have an equalized pupil, and we have a major loss of students.
Yes.
So what people have been experiencing, then there's a max loss category, so it's 3%, I think?
3.5.
3.5, so you may have, it may be actually more than 3.5, but the max loss is 3.5.
Yep.
So what essentially you have is a compilation of of equalized students that are actually, calculated but actually not there, right?
Right.
So that's also a factor of this. So you have a whole bunch of things playing into this with Act 46, small schools, phantom students, the calculation in max loss and in equalized, all kind of add into that. The idea is that it all catches up, right? It writes itself over a couple of years. But there's some protections in, you lost 100 students in a relatively small community, that could be really impactful.
My understanding is that that's being modified.
That's
so
right.
that-
That's
Right,
right.
that concept's going away.
Well, that's good news.
Yeah, yeah.
I had a couple of maybe minor things, and I'm sorry I didn't get it to you earlier, Martin, but on the capital improvement support, I wondered if it made sense to highlight liability in that paragraph as well, because I think it's implicit in safety, security, and cost impact, but when I think about schools who really might have to look at remediation initiatives or ADA compliance issues or whatever, I see a pretty significant outstanding liability issue.
Isn't that largely covered by VISBIT, as far as if it is a liability issue, or no?
No,
No? Okay.
I'm not thinking of the,
Educational
Yeah.
impact and
the Yes, fact that yeah.
you might not be serving the students appropriately
Oh,
and then
sure.
therefore open to.
Right.
but it's also not, these are not all things that I guess it, there might be insurance coverage, but if there is extended exposure and liability, that's just gonna raise rates too. So I guess.
Well, those are two different things I'm hearing from.
They are, but it was sort of the notion of liability and with both those regards.
Right.
And whether,
Yeah.
you kind of say it here in the comments, but,
No, I think it can, I think cost impacts covers liability, presumably. I mean, I could spell it out a little bit more, but I can certainly also add, it's not just safety, security, and cost, it's opportunities, are
and maybe
lost.
modify cost by inclusive of exposure or liability exposure,
Yeah,
something to that
I think
effect.
that's,
Okay, yeah, that's easy enough.
The other one on staffing ratios, I was trying to figure out the notion of artificial metrics, and I understand what you're saying, but the metric isn't artificial, and I thought maybe modify that by just saying artificial benchmarking metrics,
oh, yeah.
just
right.
as a thought there.
Yep.
And in the Act 46 one, I wondered if it made sense to, where it says, conduct analysis to determine cost savings, I wondered if it also made sense as well as the incremental tax burden placed on other
Other issues and districts.
communities, yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about.
And then the only other one I had on cost of social services on the second page, I wondered if included in there, inadequate funding from a source other, but I also wondered if there should be consideration of point of delivery on those social services.
Where they are delivered from?
Yes, yeah.
To whether schools are the appropriate place or the most
Right.
efficient place to be
Correct,
providing
yeah.
those. Yep.
I think a lot of things have ended up in the schools without funding following them, but is that appropriate?
Yeah, so examining. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay.
It looks good. Now, if you can just say those who, be all impacted in upcoming legislative
Yeah, they
session.
all, yeah, I'll make sure.
All will be approved and improved, or, that'd be great, too.
So is your goal to get that out this week?
Yeah, I'll do it, yes. That's the concept.
I had
Yep,
one on the
yep, go
second
ahead.
bullet, Martin, just
Yep.
after the word groups,
Yep,
comma, while maintaining objectivity and academic rigor.
okay.
Mm-hmm.
Anything else?
Well, thank you for doing that.
My pleasure.
All right, we'll move on to agenda item 12, negotiations update. Bridget, do you want to give an update? Really dates.
What's that?
It's really dates.
Yeah, so really, we continue to have our Monday morning planning meetings that are warned, but are then held in executive session. And then we have another date scheduled with the SBEA on November 19th. So it'll go.
December.
I'm sorry,
10th.
December.
Yeah.
December. And fading, as everyone can hear.
Sorry.
December, I might have been the wrong person to give the update. December 19th, we have another negotiations session planned. And it will be noted when the meeting is, the regular school board meeting is warned, that our executive session for our school board meeting will happen after our regular meeting instead of before, because we'll be negotiating right up until the time of our regular school board meeting. I think that's really about it.
Anything else on bargaining? All right. So we'll move on to Agenda 13, setting the agenda for the December 19th meeting.
Okay, so first, right out of the gate would be, we'll change the executive session, as Bridget just
Yep.
identified. It will be an executive session for the purposes of negotiations from 5 until 7. Then the regular meeting will start at 7, and then we'll add executive session to the end of the meeting. And we can take,
Can you confirm too how that gets added, just in terms of, do we have to adjourn public session and then, or do we go into executive
we
session
just
from
take a
public
motion to go
session?
into executive session, and then we adjourn. Yeah, we just take a motion to go into executive session.
Okay, so we don't have to come out again to public.
And then when we end the meeting, we end the meeting. Seems like, let's see. Monitoring reports, okay. Because
We were gonna-
2O will come on. We were gonna, 2O is gonna be on.
We were going to put the youth risk survey back on.
Yes, so I don't know, I'll have to do some time management here on that, but we'll add. Yeah. Okay.
All right. Agenda item 14, future agenda items.
I would like to add in there the follow-up for the youth risk survey, addressing, you could just call it that, follow-up on youth risk survey. But
We-
mainly, I think that we should,
We added
it
that
on the
back onto the agenda.
oh, I'm sorry. I was looking for my agenda while
Fine.
you were doing that.
So we're actually, we're complying with that by
Thank
putting
you.
it on the agenda.
No, I
on
got
those
you.
two.
I
Yeah.
got you. I was elsewhere. It happens.
Although David might want to put it on a future agenda item because it looks like we got a timing issue for the 19th.
I know, and that's my caveat.
Well,
I
yeah.
gotta do some adjustments, I think.
We'll allow you to reserve that right, I guess.
Yeah, all right. If it removes from
Yeah,
next.
gotcha, put it on. You got it.
So we added and
Thanks, Brian.
removed one in one fell swoop. Any other future agenda items from the board? All right. Agenda item 15, consider the minutes of the meetings of November 7th and the 26th. Any changes or comments? All right, seeing none, those are approved. And the consent agenda.
So this is a leave that's before you. Again, if I can just allude to the letter that in there, again, this is a classroom teacher at Rick Marcotte. And, again, making a request to continue her learning, but to take a year off. Both the principal and myself are in support of that. Again, doing some things that we think will provide good value upon return.
It's a little unspecific about what she's doing.
Mm-hmm.
You're broad, but
Well, it's really to spend some time specifically in other schools and educational environments to learn about how she can make those connections happen. So,
So I assume more details have been shared with you and with
yeah, and with
principal.
Yep.
And do you need action on this?
No,
Just consent agenda.
Okay,
I just wanted to give you that.
all right, thank you. AP orders, AP Order 20, any questions from the board? Seeing
I move to
none?
adjourn.
second.
All in favor?
Aye.
And we are adjourned. Thank you.